Okay. Good morning. Thank you. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Scott Wiener. I'm the Deputy for Markets Innovation at DPS, and thank you for coming to participate, either in person or through the webcast, in today's technical conference. For those of you who have been here before, I'm going to have a very abbreviated role today. I get to introduce Peter Olmsted, who will be serving as the moderator and facilitator of today's conversation. I also want to point out, for those of you that may not know, that tomorrow is Peter's last day at DPS. So we hope that this is a positive send-off for him. But most importantly, if you didn't know it, Peter is leaving us to literally walk across the street and become the Deputy Secretary for Energy on the Governor's staff as of a week from Monday. So we congratulate Peter. He has been a tremendous asset for all of us here at DPS, and I trust for all of you in the community. We won't miss him. He won't be very far. And we like to think here that at least we'll have somebody over at the chamber who knows what we do. And with that, I want to turn the microphone and the proceeding over to Peter. I'll have the opportunity to be in and out today. But again, I want to thank everybody for their participation in this very important topic.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Thanks for the kind words. And yeah, let's make this a positive send-off for me, please. So I'll try to help us make it so. So we've only got three hours here this morning, and certainly, the topic that we'll be discussing today, low-income participation in distributed energy resources in the VDER proceeding is a very important topic. As I think we heard from the Commission when they adopted the Value of Distributed Energy Resources Order in March 9th, staff and the Commission remain committed to really unlocking the potential for distributed energy resources for low-income customers. I think the Commission has always, as my colleagues from the Office of Consumer Services can attest, it's always been a priority for the Commission to be looking out for the interests and needs of low-income customers. Certainly, no easy set of issues to be addressing, as you all know, and that's why we're here today. We got some specifics. Staff in NYSERDA received some specifics from the Commission in their order, things to be considering. So I think we've got some very interesting and thought-provoking topics to discuss here this morning. So just looking at the agenda. What we'll do here is just spend a few minutes of background and overview. I've already provided a little bit of that. I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Honor Kennedy and Tom Dwyer from OCS to offer a few remarks, and then we'll jump right into it. The first item on the agenda, we'll hear from NYSERDA and the New York Green Bank regarding some of the ideas and potential programs that they've been considering in this space. So they'll be the only formal presentation here this morning. Agenda items 3 and 4 will be, I hope, more open-ended discussion with you all to really think through what the Commission asked us to look at and get some different perspectives from you all. So in terms of logistics here, obviously we were not able to fit everybody around the table. I apologize for that. But for folks who are in the back, if you do have remarks on, specific items, we asked for that those around the table make some space so everybody gets to participate. There's a podium over here too that you could use if you're more comfortable with that. So we'll try to keep it free-flowing here and hope to have some good discussion over the next few hours. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everyone. Just along the lines of some background, I know I see a lot of familiar faces from our earlier CDG Low Income Collaborative. And that effort, a lot of work went into that. It spanned, I think, 2015 and 16. And as a lot of you who are involved in that know, one of the main issues identified, particularly with respect to low-income customers, a lot of it boils down to financing. And at the conclusion of that collaborative, a report was issued that ultimately that concluded that there was more work that needed to be done specifically to address some of the financing issues, and staff went back and has been working on a white paper without foreclosing the option of a market solution, to also investigate the option of potential utility ownership of a CDG project directed towards low-income customers. And then, while that work is ongoing, we have this new opportunity presented by the VDER order that has the potential to provide additional market solutions to provide CDG to low-income customers. So we're sort of combining those efforts now, and we really have a great opportunity to build off of the great deal of work that was done earlier, and to incorporate, what's been brought to the table by the VDER order, and kind of produce a joint paper. I believe the deadline is September 1st. So do you have anything else to add, Anna?
I would just like to add that a lot of the work that did go on the initial collaborative, a lot of that information has been brought back within the agency and has been really useful in helping guide with some other activities associated with CDG. So I just want to make sure folks know that it's been really utilized.
Great. So before I turn it over, I guess this is the time to turn it over to NYSERDA, but Chris Cole is here, and he's going to lead us through the first substantive item on the agenda, and I think he's got some colleagues on the phone from the Green Bank that are also going to offer some thoughts. So let's see, what do we have? We've got about 45 minutes for this. I'm not sure exactly how long you have to present, but what we'll do is we'll run through the slides and then, open it up for questions and discussion. And again, we'll try to stay on time here and get everybody out of here by 12. So with that, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And is there okay, so you'll advance the slides? All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out bright and early for this meeting. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Cole. At NYSERDA, I'm our lead on our low and moderate income strategy and policy team. So I work across all of our NYSERDA teams when it comes to developing strategies and programmatic approaches to serving low and moderate income customers. I also work with many of the state agencies that are represented here today, and also with the utilities. With me today, just to highlight some additional attendance from NYSERDA staff, Hutan Movani, who's the Assistant Director of New York Sun, is here, as well as Liz Tremblay and Michelle Andre, who are project managers on New York Sun, and they're responsible for a lot of the work that we're doing on affordable solar. Also on the phone, we have Alfred Griffin, who is the president of the New York Green Bank. So Alfred will be providing a brief overview of some of the thinking that has been going on around how the Green Bank could support CDG projects that benefit low-income customers. So just a note on how we'll kind of structure this. I have a number of slides that I'll go through. I'll turn it over to Alfred at a certain point. Then Alfred has some time constraints, so we'll try to get through kind of the Green Bank discussion and any of the questions that you might have for the Green Bank before Alfred has to leave at about 9:45. And then we'll use the balance of the time to wrap up on this concept that I'll be talking about. I guess, go ahead, Peter. Yeah. The next slide. Yeah. So, we wanted to discuss kind of a concept that's been in development for a little while. We've done a lot of thinking kind of about how NYSERDA could be involved in supporting low-income participation in CDG projects. And we also, have done a lot of talking with many of you in the room here today, kind of starting back to the CDG process that started in 2015, and we've still had conversations kind of from there, with the Clean Energy Advisory Council, and through various interactions, at meetings and so on and so forth. So, so some of what you're going to see here today, some of you have seen before or have heard about, but we'd really like to get as much candid input as we can from everyone here today on kind of what we're thinking, and let us know how we can kind of mold and adapt it to a point where it makes sense for not only LMI consumers but also the industry as well. We don't know all the answers. We don't have them. That's what we're going to be relying on you folks to kind of help us along the path. In terms of the opportunity for CDG and low income and moderate income customers, NYSERDA kind of sees this as kind of a part of a holistic approach for really improving energy affordability and access to renewables for these vulnerable customers. As many of you know, under the Clean Energy Fund, we have a pretty strong commitment to providing solutions for low-income customers. We're committing roughly $234 million over the first 3 years of the Clean Energy Fund to low and moderate income clean energy solutions, and something on the order of $750 million over the 10-year CEF will be targeted at LMI initiatives. When it comes to CDG, I think a lot of you are aware of some of the potential benefits that this offers LMI customers. Clearly they don't need to own their own home, so this is a great opportunity for renters. We also know that most of the LMI customers in the state are renters. There's the potential for kind of subscriptions to be shaped to the needs of LMI customers. We're thinking of things like no upfront costs or long-term lock-ins and reliable energy cost savings. But we also know that the CDG market in the state is still relatively nascent. So there's not a lot happening when it comes to LMI participation in CDG. So we really want to. We're thinking of an initiative that could help kind of spur LMI participation in CDG in this early market for community shared solar. Next slide, please, Peter. So when we're talking about kind of our key goals and objectives for LMI participation in community solar, we really want to look at first and foremost, significant participation. Given that the market is relatively new, we're thinking in the next few years we want to see in the order of thousands of LMI customers participating in CDG projects. Secondly, we're looking for really meaningful cost savings. When we're thinking about affordability and the Commission's energy affordability policy, we'd really like the CDG offering that we have to complement that. In addition to the other LMI initiatives that we have to offer to reduce energy burdens, such as energy efficiency. Also, consumer protections are going to be super important here, obviously, as I think many of you will kind of attest to. We also want to expand and support the overall community solar market and as it develops. So we'd like to develop an initiative that is attractive not only to the LMI customers but also to developers. In this initial initiative, we're hoping that we can establish some models for CDG participation that could be replicated in the broader market as it unfolds. Community-driven projects are also going to be a priority, so we see a lot of value in having local governments or community-based organizations kind of leading participation in these efforts. And we'd also like to see kind of a range or a variation in project types and locations. So not only geographic distribution across the state, but we'd like to see, CDG projects sited in areas that that were once kind of brownfields that could be repurposed for CDG. There's potential for CDG on affordable multifamily buildings. So we'd like to kind of see kind of a broad range of project types that we support here. And then, like I mentioned earlier, this is an evolving market, so we want this early initiative to help kind of set the stage, and we want that to be scaled, so we can improve and increase the number of LMI customers that are participating in CDG projects in the future. Next slide, Peter. Now, in terms of this concept that I'll be talking about, so like I said earlier, this is really tailored to kind of the current stage of the market when it comes to CDG. This is kind of a concept in development, and like I said, we really want your feedback on this throughout the day today. So we have roughly $24 million that we're planning on allocating to an initial 3-year initiative to support low-income and moderate-income participation in CDG. This would be part of our LMI chapter of the Clean Energy Fund, so it would be filed kind of following the regulatory process set up in the Clean Energy Fund. We are thinking that we'll have distinct goals for low-income customers and moderate-income customers, as well as we think we'll need to have distinct strategies for participation for low and moderate-income customers as well. So depending on your thoughts on that, we'd like to hear some input on that later today. So in terms of kind of rolling this out, we're thinking of NYSERDA kind of using its potential purchasing power to secure solar credits for LMI customers. So we would release a solicitation that would essentially seek to leverage the current queue of CDG projects that is kind of that's out there, and seek to secure credits, subscriptions from each of those projects for LMI participation. We would clearly be looking to establish requirements for savings that the customer has to achieve relative to kind of their default electric rate, and also specific contract terms that would benefit low-income customers as well as the developers. As far as the subscriptions are concerned, we'd want to prioritize total cost savings. So rather than looking at kind of KWH, we'd really want to look at what's the total bill savings that the LMI customer can be expected to see. And we've also been thinking through a few strategies with the New York Green Bank to kind of get low-cost capital into shared solar projects that serve LMI customers. So partnering with CDFIs and community development capital providers, to set up the Green Bank in a kind of a role to kind of underwrite some of these projects. So I think Alfred's on the phone, and in a few minutes I'll turn it over to him so he can kind of talk through some of those concepts that are kind of under consideration at this point. The last thing I think which is important here is in terms of enrolling customers and doing outreach, we'd really like to leverage the many LMI-specific energy programs that are currently being administered in the state. So not only the NYSERDA energy efficiency programs, but we also have the Home Energy Assistance Program, which serves 1.4 million low-income households. We have the Weatherization Assistance Program, which serves a large number of low-income households a year. We'd like to kind of think through how we would leverage those programs to identify and potentially enroll customers into a CDG project, kind of removing some of the customer acquisition kind of burden from the developer as it relates to getting people signed up into these projects. Next slide, Peter. And so this slide is kind of just a brief illustration, kind of overly simplified of this concept I spoke through. We don't have to kind of walk through it completely, but you see, that we have the NYSERDA involvement kind of on the left end, kind of with the enrollment or outreach and enrollment for LMI customers through existing programs. Below that, we have kind of the solicitation that we are thinking of releasing. And then that would kind of turn into a contract that NYSERDA has with the developer for the solar credits. And then underneath, then we have the community developer kind of involvement there. So that's a brief overview of kind of the strategy I just spoke through. Next slide, Peter. Oh, so okay. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Alfred. Alfred, are you on the phone?
Yeah, hey Chris, I am.
Hey, Alfred. So we're gonna.
Morning.
Good morning. And Peter, could you just flip the slide one more? Okay. Okay, Alfred, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks Chris, and thank you Peter, and good morning everyone. With me here is Rodrigo Perifero, and he will be with the conversation for the duration after I have to leave. But New York Green Bank is spending a lot of time on CDG. Obviously, one of the great benefits, as Chris went through, of CDG is opening up the availability of solar generation. We understand the importance of making this available to LMI and the importance of driving down costs as much as possible as relates to this target customer set. And one way that we think we can do that, and we've been investigating this in partnership with our colleagues at NYSERDA, with some financial institutions that lend dollars to CDFIs for certain purposes, is to basically have New York Green Bank set up a vehicle that would be LMI focused, that would be underwriting transactions, according to pre-agreed criteria with our banking partners. The banking partners that would be participating would be the pockets within those firms that typically provide capital to CDFIs. We understand that at least at some of those banks that a vehicle like this would in fact qualify potentially as a CDFI from their lending standpoint, which means they can provide very attractive cost of capital. The idea being that Green Bank would do the upfront work on the underwriting, would do the ongoing portfolio management, would receive capital from the banks to be used for this specific purpose. We would guarantee that capital from the bank, but we would expect that by accessing that capital, the debt capital would be at pricing that would otherwise not be available, and in fact pricing that would be inside less than non-LMI pricing, because being LMI focused, able to tap into the pockets of capital that provide more subsidized type pricing, which obviously drives great value for the end user. So that's the concept. We are having iterative conversations with our banking partners. We feel like based on those conversations today, there is something to this. They're engaged. We're engaged. It's relatively early stages, but we're optimistic that we will be able to bring to bear very efficiently priced debt capital to this particular market, with Green Bank leading the upfront and the ongoing underwriting work to be done. And also I want to point out that, in addition to debt financing with projects, there's always, of course, a need for tax equity, given all the value in the tax credits, and we stand, ready and willing to provide credit enhancement to tax equity providers to help pull those participants into this market. We're having numerous conversations around those roles for projects that may not necessarily be LMI focused, but we also very much want to have conversations with tax equity participants for LMI focused projects, and we think given the newness of these transaction types, the relatively small transaction sizes, where we don't yet have scale, that our playing a role like that can be an important role for us to play to pull that very important tax equity into this market sector. So we're pretty excited about the conversations that we're having. There's still a good bit of detail to be worked out, but that's the basic concept of how we hope to bring super efficiently priced capital into this particular target market.
Great, thanks, Alfred. Do we have I guess we could take a few questions. I mean, does anyone have any questions for Alfred? I mean, while we have him, can I open it up for any specific questions? And if you could just announce yourself, since Alfred is on the phone.
Hey, Alfred, it's Ron Leonard from Eco Energy. How are you doing?
Ron, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I for those of you who haven't had conversations with Alfred like I and others have, we're talking to an honest broker who is really forward thinking in terms of moving the agenda forward. And I'm really curious, Alfred, what do you think the appetite is for this crazy thing that we're talking about, community solar for CDG? Are the banks up to doing this type of work?
Well, it's a great question, Ron, and I think the answer is yes, but for CDG generally, I think that the banks are very interested. They're starting to dig in. There are a lot of aspects to these transactions that will, as they dig into the detail, will create angst. In many cases, the lack of the long-term, PPA or net metering agreement that, for say 20 years that can't be opted out of and so forth. That's sort of outside of what banks are typically accustomed to looking at. There's the remarketing aspects. That's something that they're not accustomed to having to consider, which all sort of makes them think there's merchant-like risk embedded in the transactions, and doesn't make it a perfect fit for what they've been doing. We therefore expect for the earlier projects that there's an important role for the Green Bank to play to help pave the way to get some precedents done, to help establish that remarketing in fact can be done by having some projects up and running, taking a forward-leaning approach to thinking about how to protect creditors against not having necessarily 20-year contracts and having that embedded potential price volatility as the power is remarketed. So we're using approaches that have been used in other asset classes to have an appropriate credit package there. So I think Ron, they're interested. I think they will be there. I think it's going to be helpful to get some projects done and have some precedent and some real scale, so it can be made very clear that there is a real scalable market here. As relates to LMI specifically, I think there, given that some of these banks do have pockets of capital that are focused on that market, I think there's an additional willingness in that particular target market to try to find a way to put capital to work. They do oftentimes for smaller transaction sizes like this, where there's not a tremendous amount of capital at work in the early days to work through an intermediary, and we think we're potentially the right intermediary to help get that done. Does that help answer your question, Ron?
Thanks, Alfred. That's why you're there.
Thanks, Ron. Do we have any other questions for Alfred? Yep.
Hey, Alfred, this is Kelly Roach from Solstice. Pardon my voice, my allergies have kicked in. I want to pick up
Kelly.
on, hi, I'd like to pick up on your point about the 20-year contract. Just to chime in, that 20-year contracts don't work for low and middle income people by and large. They don't work for renters. It's asking for a commitment that's out of size with people's life experience. And so I'm wondering to what extent you can talk about how you think banks would be willing to participate in projects that are a little more innovative with respect to contract length and flexibility, and if that greater risk would actually make this program more difficult to implement, because it just seems essential to me that any solution be looking at flexible contracts. Without that, it's just not going to work for low and middle income people.
No, I understand, and I think it's a lot of developers have the same viewpoint even for non-LMI. Our approach to this market, where you're going to have shorter term contracts, is to rather than size our debt capital based just on a sort of current contracted price and sort of extrapolating that out, assuming the contracts will continue to be at the current price with escalators. We basically are having a lesser of concept. So we say when we think about project revenues, we're going to forecast out over the life of the asset, say a 20-year period, or the CDG program. The cash flows to be generated from the production, and of course a function of that is at what price would the credits be sold, and just keeping it simple for a minute and talking about grandfathered projects where it's pure net metering. Our approach there is to look at where the contract price is, and also we've engaged Navigant, a third-party engineering firm, to provide for every zone, every class customer a forecast, a 20-year forecast, low gas forecast, base case, and upside case for power, and they'll be updating that on a quarterly basis for us. So we will look at the contracted price, and then we'll look at that forecast forward curve provided to us by Navigant, and then take, say, 90% of that, with the presumption that the power needs to be sold at a discount, and we'll take the lesser of. And that's how we'll think about how much leverage we can have against a project, and then that forecast will be updated on a quarterly basis. And if it turns out that the forward curve shifts down, then we would be looking to sweep away cash flow to push to drive the debt down back to the appropriate coverage ratios. A shift in the forward curve would not create a default in the deal. If our forward-looking coverages were out of balance, it would just simply create cash sweeps to bring us back into line. We think that's an appropriate way to protect lenders against this risk, where you don't necessarily have the long-term fixed contracts. It's not something that I think U.S. lenders are accustomed to seeing, but one thing we're modeling this off of, where we get comfort that banks will ultimately get there, is that in Europe there are deals, including larger utility scale deals, done where the pricing's at more traditional project finance bank-like pricing, attractive pricing, where you may have a long-term contract, but it's not necessarily a fixed price contract. It's more of an indexed contract, and this is how that risk is managed in those markets. So we do think there's precedent that banks can ultimately get their head around this. Will ultimately embrace this approach, and this would be the approach to manage the lack of a price certain long-term contract. So that's our basic approach there, Kelly. I think with transactions getting done, and if banks are struggling, early on to engage in something like this, in part because there's so many other things they can do that don't have this risk right now in the market. We're here to help lead the way, and as relates to the program we were just discussing, one way we can lead the way is by providing credit enhancement in the form of guarantees to that bank capital that we're pulling into the market. Does that help answer your question, Kelly?
A little bit, thank you. Yeah, I think the just drilling down on how risk averse these partners actually are, and therefore how likely this program is to be able to happen, I think is just the devil's in the details with that. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, and so clearly we have a little more to think through there. And just a quick time check. So we have Alfred for another few minutes. So I think we have one more question here. 2 questions. We'll do them really quickly, but Alfred has to leave soon. 3 questions. Okay, can we make them short?
Yeah, and perhaps my question isn't for Alfred. Maybe it's more for you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is Amanda Trinzi for the City of New York. So one thing that Alfred just said was using an indexed contract instead of a fixed price contract. And, one thought that I've been having about this lately, and the city has participated a great deal in the low-income low-income CDG collaborative, and we're supportive of CDG, of course. But understanding, what are the additional costs associated with a CDG project, and how are those going to impact low-income customers? And when I hear, something about an indexed price that's going to fluctuate over time, that gives me a little bit of worry. Because
and Amanda, let me interrupt real quick just before you go on. When I said index, I wasn't. I mean, there may be some parties out there offering an index price. I wasn't suggesting that this LMI program would be an index price program. I'm just suggesting that if you have short-term contracts, like if you want to bring in the LMI community and you feel like you can only have 1 or 2 or 3 year contracts, the fact that lenders have to assume that you have to redo new contracts every 2 or 3 years. It's a lender in effect might view it as having the risk of being, from a lender's perspective, of being indexed.
Okay, and I guess that's kind of where my confusion's coming in, is what is the customer going to see versus I think you're talking about what the lenders and the banks are how they're looking at this. So I guess I'm asking for clarity as to what is the customer going to see as far as a contract? Is it going to be a 2-3 year contract? Is it going to be a 20-year contract? Is it varying or fixed? And perhaps that's more something for Chris to answer. Right.
Yeah. And Alfred, I'll just chime in real quick. So that's still kind of undecided, right? So, we'd like to get input from you all on kind of what makes the most sense from the customer's perspective. Considering kind of the energy impacts, the dollar impacts that we want to kind of deliver to those customers, but then also the consumer protections. So that's something that we'll need to kind of work through.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we also have to think about when we're working through that is with low income communities sometimes, especially in the city, sometimes people are moving in, people are moving out. Who's living there is changing, and if someone's locked into a 3-year contract or a 10-year contract, I don't know how that would work. So just something to think about.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Adam. Really quick, if you can make it a short question.
Yeah, I can manage that, Chris. Alfred, hi, Adam Flint here. I'm glad to hear your voice.
Hey, Adam, how are you?
I'm doing okay. 2 quick questions. One is we are working on building a fund for cooperatively owned CDG, that's LMI. And have you given any thought to how the Green Bank might work with such a fund? And I'll wait for your answer for the second question.
No, but we'd be delighted to think about that with you.
Okay, and then the other question, in terms of CDFIs, I'm just curious to know, is there CDFI service in all 62 counties of New York? Because I know we don't have one specifically based in the places where I work. So just a question to...
So in this construct, the banks would be viewing this New York Green Bank managed portfolio as in effect a CDFI, as fitting their CDFI bucket. So it would. So I think the location of a third party CDFI wouldn't be important in this particular. Wouldn't be critical in this particular conversation, because we would in effect be acting as that CDFI on behalf of the bank, if you follow it.
Yes, thank you.
And we of course are here to work in partnership with NYSERDA and all the folks on this call to try to get this market up and running across the state.
Yep. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Alfred. And Alfred, if we can entertain one more question, and then for folks, if you have any other thoughts for the New York Green Bank, we can talk after the presentation.
Hi, Chris Raup with Con Edison. I guess it wasn't clear to me what the relationship is between the NYSERDA solicitation for the solar credits and the bank financing that Green Bank would be underwriting. Or is it that NYSERDA? It felt almost like NYSERDA was paying back a loan that the Green Bank was issuing, but that doesn't seem like that would be what you would be proposing. But if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between those two things.
Right. Alfred,
so the idea is, yes, Green Bank would be supporting the financing of the program that Chris has just described. We're obviously also involved in a lot of conversations with developers, unrelated to this program. But as relates to this particular program, depending on how all the details work out, it may be that in the early years, some of the revenues may in fact be coming from NYSERDA. But as I understand the program, the NYSERDA role may be Chris, correct me, but I think maybe a 2, 3, 5 year role. These assets, in order to finance these assets, our capital and other parties' capital won't be fully paid down based on 3 or 5 years of revenues. So we will be taking on credit risk that's beyond NYSERDA payments, because we'll be looking to 15 and 20 year project cash flows for repayment, not just the initial NYSERDA-led initiative to pull LMI into these projects in the early years.
Right, Alfred. You got it. Great.
I'm sorry, can you hear me? This is Warren Myers from the Department of Public Service. Before we let Alfred go, I wanted to assure him about one thing. It's not often we get to talk directly to the bankers or the people that talk to bankers, but I thought I heard in your voice a little concern about the value stack approach vis-a-vis traditional net metering and, of course, a 20-year fixed contract. I just wanted to let you know, in case you haven't been told this before, but there are some significant elements in the VDER value stack that are locked in for 25 years, which would not be the case under traditional net metering.
I understand, Warren, and thank you for pointing that out. And I didn't mean to express concern. I probably did hesitate because I'll have to admit I haven't mastered. I need to master, but I haven't mastered VDER yet. but we certainly intend to, and it has been pointed out to us, as you've pointed out, that in fact there's some incremental value with VDER, including the 25-year period that isn't available under the grandfathered projects. So we will. We've spent most of our time to date, and really because that's where the developers have been pushing us to date on the grandfathered piece. But we will, and with your help and NYSERDA's help, find a way to get things done under VDER.
And pass it on to your banking friends.
All right. Well, thanks again, Alfred. It looks like we're a little over time for you, so I appreciate you sticking around.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So, Peter, if you can scroll back maybe 2 slides, and we can kind of wrap up the slide deck. So, as I mentioned, this concept is not fully baked. There's still kind of a number of considerations that we have, and so there might be some of these still open questions that you have some input on today, or potentially later on, which is fine. So we talked a little bit about earlier, kind of how do we identify customers for participation in this initiative? How do we enroll them? How do we do this in an equitable manner? Given that the number of customers we're actually going to be able to impact with this initiative is not going to be kind of as large as the LMI population is in the state. So that's an important consideration for us. Also, what are the roles for kind of all of the parties kind of involved here? Is there a role for the utilities to be involved? What are the roles for the developers when it comes to kind of enrolling customers and identifying them? What does the who's the intermediary there? So, is that a role that NYSERDA can play, or is it best suited for a third party? So those are some of the thoughts that we have there. In terms of kind of subscription length, kind of Amanda, this gets a little bit, I think, to the question you had earlier. Are we think would a shorter term, kind of more flexible kind of subscription be most appropriate here, or should we be seeking to kind of lock in 20-year subscriptions for LMI customers? So that's still kind of an open question. How did the benefits to the customers flow? From the developer through the utility to the customer. Is there another alternative that can be considered? We have a robust portfolio of energy efficiency programs in the state. So how do we align this initiative with those programs? So when we're really talking about reducing energy consumption and energy burdens, it would be great if we could kind of leverage the work that we're doing in these homes to reduce consumption before providing them with benefits from renewable energy. So there's a lot of questions still kind of there. And then in terms of scalability and sustainability of this approach, clearly it's going to be difficult for us to administer kind of a rolling solicitation, to procure solar credits for LMI customers. It could be quite expensive. So how do we take this initial approach, that we're kind of thinking of helping to kind of kickstart this nascent market? How do we take that and kind of adapt it and evolve it so it can be supportive of LMI customers and the CDG market long term? So that's a big question that we still have. Sure, you can ask a question. Amanda has a question.
On enrollment.
Can you speak into the mic? Just
yeah. Forgive me if I'm just not up to speed on this, but is this voluntary enrollment? Where you'd go out, knock on doors or whatever, you do some type of campaign and solicit low to moderate income folks to enroll, or are you looking to migrate full populations of, buildings and whatnot? Has that been discussed?
It hasn't been decided. So it could be, or we could look at the potential of looking at participants in existing efficiency programs and identifying the right candidates for this this type of of participation. So it's really something that's up for discussion with you all. Next slide, Peter. And I guess, last thing I'll say of that is, in terms of our considerations, in order for this to work, there needs to be kind of, value in it for not only the LMI customers, but, the developers as well. So as we're kind of thinking through these important issues, we need to kind of think what's the right equation so it works for everyone involved and we have something to build on for, for future LMI participation. Now, when it comes to timeline, so we'd like to move relatively quickly. Speaking from a bureaucratic entity, that can mean a bunch of different things. But we'd like to have a launch of this initiative in later this year. So fall is probably aggressive, but we're shooting for the fall time frame. If we can get something launched by the end of the year, we'd be really happy. But essentially, we're working on kind of stakeholder engagement now. So a number of you have been speaking with our New York Sun team, led by Michelle and Liz and Max Joel. And we'll continue those engagements over the next month or so. And we'll be developing an investment plan, which we would file with DPS for review, consultation, and approval before we're able to launch the initiative. And we're targeting kind of the summertime for that investment plan filing. June, July. Ideally, it would be June, but we'll push for that. And like I said, we'd like to have something launched by the end of the year so that we can take advantage of some of those CDG projects that are already in the queue and get started that way. I think that's all I had in terms of content. So, Peter. So we have a few minutes if you want to open up for questions. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we do so, though, I just wanted to acknowledge that we've been joined by Commissioner Berman. So, welcome. Do you want to say any words?
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I was late. I was at the doctor's, so I came as soon as I could. But I do appreciate being here, and I look forward to further discussion and collaboration on this issue as others. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. So yeah, I think we can roll into some questions for Chris and the rest of his team if there are any. So around the table, if you're out in the audience, feel free to elbow your way to the table or up to the podium. Jessica, and please announce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jessica Agile with Alliance for a Green Economy. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just keep a couple. One of the basic questions I have is this $24 million. Where did that number come from? Is it designed to kind of meet a certain goal of LMI participation across the state? I'm just sort of wondering the kind of underpinnings of the whole program.
Yeah, so our team did some analysis looking at the number of customers that we'd be able to benefit, and we're thinking kind of in the $24 million would support, actually, let me take a step back. So there's $24 million total, but I think our investment in this initiative is what? Do we have that number, Liz or Michelle? So what's the total budget we're thinking for this initial solicitation? I want to say it's something like $6 million. And we did some analysis to look at how many customers we could actually, leverage with those funds, and it was around 10,000. But so the $24 million was a budget that we carved out of the total CEF, the initial 3-year CEF budget to support these activities. So whether or not, the full $24 million goes into this activity is still undecided.
So you have sort of potentially money for other programs to support LMI participation in CDG. Okay.
We do.
And this is separate from New York Sun because it's
This is separate from New York Sun. It's CEF. Yep.
Great. And I guess one other question I have is just about process and whether you I think we in the Energy Democracy Alliance have been kicking around this idea, and we have I think a lot of deep thinking on it that we'd love to share. And whether you would like that to happen in a meeting, would you like written comments? Kind of what's the best way to get our...
I think some written comments would be helpful, but it would be helpful to discuss those comments in a meeting. So, perhaps we could set up a time to connect on that.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Jessica.
So maybe I just want to quickly take the opportunity to respond to the comments. We did, as part of the technical conferences last week, we did solicit written comments on that subject matter into the docket by April 17th. So you should consider the topics addressed here today in the same vein. So that would be one opportunity that I'd throw out there.
Thank you. It just seems like the NYSERDA process is a little separate from the VDER process.
Absolutely.
And given the complexity of VDER and the comments needed and the shortness of the deadline, I think we'd like to do a separate filing or
and with regard to comments, we also have an email address that we'll give out. So anyone else who has thoughts or comments on this can just send us an email, and we'll kind of take it from there.
And if I could debate
Warren's
esteemed
going to override me here.
I think the April 17th soft date for unofficial comments was just to accommodate the filings that are coming in May 1st, which is not this. So I don't think you should feel pressured to get written comments in by April 17th on this issue. But obviously, the sooner the better.
Yeah. And we wouldn't send them back.
Would it be helpful if our comments went to both agencies? Okay.
Yes. We would share them anyway.
Hey, good morning. Hannah Master-John with the Clean Energy Collective. First, I just want to say thank you to NYSERDA and the Green Bank for, I think, really digging in and focusing here and listening to stakeholder feedback over the last year. And it sounds like that's starting to result in real proposals, and that's really exciting. I work nationwide on community solar, and there's a whole lot of states that want to figure out how to do it for LMI, and pretty much nobody that has. So I hope that we can actually do it here. I have just a few questions, and I think you're probably going to tell me we're not there yet. That's okay.
That's fine.
But
Yep.
things like in your PowerPoint you talk about providing significant cost savings to LMI consumers. Like, what do folks think that means? I'm especially interested in kind of what you say you want to support, LMI focused projects. Again, kind of what does that mean? Like, what % of a project going toward LMI would be considered an LMI focused project? And I think that that's really interesting. I would want to leave a lot of flexibility there, because I think you could see, projects that should be 100% LMI. That could make sense in some circumstances. But I also think you might be able to get kind of some synergies and some extra benefits if you looked at kind of spreading the wealth, right, among projects that might have non-LMI subscribers as well. Because I think you have a lot of projects across the state that are CDG projects that are in need of financial support, and obviously, a high credit-worthy off-taker and Green Bank support can go a long way there. So, and then I'm guessing that if you did take that approach where part of a project were to go to NYSERDA through this procurement, that would count for sort of the small customer, the 60% portion of it, because it is going to residential consumers. But I think, again, that's another question.
Yeah.
And then kind of Jessica asked a couple of my questions, but so you're looking at about maybe 10,000 customers to start. Any thought to geographic breakdowns or how that gets sorted?
Yeah. So thanks, Hannah. And those are still open questions. When we're talking about significant savings, clearly we want to see a lower rate than kind of what the default rate would be for these customers. What that is, we're not kind of certain, because some of that will depend on how kind of the the financing works and kind of, what's actually there for the customer to benefit from. So we'd like, if you have specific thoughts on that, we'd love to hear them. When it comes to the kind of what portion of a project needs to be LMI, that's another kind of question that is unanswered at this point. Is it a certain percentage? Maybe based on the region or the type of project. Maybe we have different kind of thresholds for LMI participation. And in terms of geographic distribution, we don't have a set kind of target in mind at this point. Yeah, but yeah, definitely. Yep. Yep.
You say the default. You're talking about what the customer would pay with the utility?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Adam.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to float some of the ideas that we've been batting around in the Alliance. This has obviously been all very quick. So we're not where we want to be yet as far as baking this in. But I think first off, we really value, I think, as all of us do, simplicity and predictability, cheapness of administration, and think that this may not be the way to go about that, frankly. We also feel that we can't lose another year. Just in terms of the perception publicly of this work and this program. We've been out there flogging this for a couple of years already. So I'm personally pretty worried about a late 2017 rollout, which I know is also ambitious as things go. So in terms of some ideas, one is you've got New York Sun's block program right now. And there's clearly going to be some changes to that program. So why not change the program, first of all, to diversify into 3 regions, because clearly Hudson Valley and Capital is not like the rest of the state and shouldn't be lumped together for any of New York Sun. And make sure that you're scaling incentives in terms of size, right? Because as this looks from those who know more than I do, in the upstate area, we're not going to see anything small with this program that's being proposed. It just won't work. The economics aren't going to be there. And there's precedent for this in Massachusetts. So you have a modified New York Sun block program. Secondly, pilots with gap funding. We want to make this scalable just like everybody else, but I think we've got the cart before the horse. We need to have projects in the ground that serve LMI to learn from in order to decide how this is going to work. I don't think we can decide up front how this is going to work and then hope that it does work. I think we've tried that, and I don't think we should keep trying. As far as the role of the bank, it's good that you've got this tandem going, a loan loss reserve to reduce cost of capital, working with local lenders, CDFIs. That sounds great. And then in terms of savings, I'd like to see a 25-25, 25% savings, 25% participation. That's easy to remember. We can talk more about this obviously towards the end of the program, but I wanted to throw that out early on.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, we should follow up on that. I guess, hi.
Hi, my name's Sage. I'm from Push Buffalo.
Put that on the light on.
There we go. Got it. Push. Yeah. So my name's Sage. I'm from Push Buffalo. I'm the solar energy advocate over there. So I manage a solar aggregation program focused on LMI communities, mostly on rooftop solar. But we're also working on some community solar ideas that we've had in our Energy Democracy Committee for a while. If you're familiar with Push, we started as a grassroots. So a lot of our work kind of starts from bringing the community to the table and having them be part of that discussion. So in one of your earlier slides, I think it was under goals, you said that community-driven projects is a goal for you. Can you define just at this point what community-driven means to you?
Yeah, so we'd like to see projects that have kind of significant involvement, either leadership from a community-based organization that kind of represents and serves the community that the project is sited in, or local government kind of involvement in terms of promoting or leading the effort. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll probably have lots more questions later, but yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sage. Hey, Chris.
The NYSERDA solicitation is for the solar credits.
Right.
But the solar credits are the things that the customers want. So could you talk a little bit about like what it is that you're buying and how that under your program, how that would move on to the customer's bill?
So we would be buying kind of the generation for that would translate to the customer in terms of how what the process looks like to get the credits, the generation of the credits onto the bill. It's still kind of up in the air in terms of how that would actually work. But if you have thoughts, we'd like to discuss them.
Hi, Kelly from Solstice again. Sort of a quick question about timeline. Seen this presented a couple of times, and I think initially it was a 5-year program, but then I believe you just said 3 in presenting it today, so I wanted to clarify that, and also to that point talk a little bit about what the long-term impact and investment of this program looks like, and that it's great that we would be, providing some temporary relief, but my concern is at the end of the 3 to 5 years, there's kind of no lasting benefit for these communities. So if we're talking about something like using some of this money to procure community ownership of these projects, or using something like a loan loss reserve to make sure that people can continue to enroll in contracts that provide them savings even after the program expires. Otherwise, I'm not sure that it's the best use of the funding.
Right. Yeah. So it would be a 3-year investment. So we expect that the initiative would last probably around 5 years. Now, in terms of what happens after the term kind of expires, that's a concern for us. So we're still thinking through what that means for program design, but also for the customers, right? So we don't want to create a situation where there's a cliff where customers are kind of getting used to kind of having this additional kind of electric, and kind of adjusting habits, and then all of a sudden they're without it. So we want to avoid that. Hey, Dave. It's on. Yep.
Association for Energy Affordability. I guess my basic question is the use of the term low-income customer implies that we're only dealing with the direct residential customer, and in fact, in multifamily buildings, we're really dealing with the building, as a residential building. And I think we should think about using the term the low LMI household, not customer.
Point taken. Yep. So we did not intend to imply that.
A whole series of things about the way you come at this point. I mean, looking at the master meter issue, we really do have a supportive housing and multifamily in New York City that are created for LMI customers, maintained for them, and there are ways to translate benefits that come to the building to the residents. I'm just concerned to make sure that we address that issue in the language effectively.
Right. Thanks, Dave.
What do we think? Any more questions for Chris, or should we continue on with our agenda?
We'll be here all for the duration, so we can
all day,
talk
all
later.
night.
Yeah. I guess maybe one more question. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, now it's on. Melanie Santiago Mojo with Vote Solar. I want to add my compliments and gratitude to all of you for really digging in and coming up with some innovative approaches for serving LMI customers and reducing their energy burden. I really, really appreciate all the work that you've done on this. I have a clarifying question to start, and then just some questions for consideration. My clarifying question is, there have been, I think, a couple of different interpretations of this program. One interpretation is that you would just be buying credits from projects and allocating them to low and moderate income households, and not necessarily having those households connected to a project via like a subscription or a community involvement or something. Another interpretation is that there would be more connection between the households being served through this program and an actual project. So I wonder if you can maybe just clarify what your thinking on that is?
Yeah, so, I think we want to see connection between the customer and the project, but we haven't, formalized that, that aspect, that relationship, yet either. So, if there are compelling reasons, to just secure credits and allocate those to customers, that's something we would consider as well.
Great, thank you. And just some thoughts for just some thinking. We're wondering if there are ways to structure an RFP to give some weight for added community benefits that might come of project development, something like job training, plans for enhanced community involvement in project development, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to the point of thinking how the RFP would be structured, but those are good points, and yeah, thanks for raising them. Yeah, we'll consider them. Yep. One more from Sage.
I should be real quick. Yeah. So kind of piggybacking on the master meter question of before, and I tend to work more so with households and individual rooftop solar than this community version of it. And a lot of the benefits of the household version is that it adds equity to homes. It's an ownership. We advocate for an ownership model in our area. I'm in Buffalo, so an ownership makes more sense than a lease in a lot of ways. For these community solar versions of things where individual households aren't actually owning the technology, owning the system, but are paying into it, is there a way to consider things about where is that equity being centralized? Is that going to developers? Specifically, is that how do we make it easier for municipalities to own that technology, and if they're not a developer, how do we consider things like jobs to make sure that any of that money that is going up front is trickling down in those communities, considering that they're not actually buying into the system itself? I don't know if that's a question. Do you think that's a question more so on the banking side of things? Is that a question on how we incentivize it to developers? What kind of community benefits agreements we insist on in our RFPs with contractors? Are they hiring X number of people locally to install a system that of X size, considering that, a community group couldn't necessarily own that? I think we have a lot of questions around where's that money going to be, or where's that, wealth after the fact going to be centralized once the money's spent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when it comes to, the co-benefits of these projects, we haven't kind of, formalized kind of our thinking on that either. However, those are important considerations. To the extent that we can, kind of build in some sort of consideration for that, I think, we'll be thinking about that. But, as of now, we don't have a plan for that aspect. Yeah. Thanks, Sage.
Sure. Yeah. One more.
On the linkage with existing energy efficiency programs, are you thinking of some ways to really lock in some kind of commitment of requiring energy efficiency as part of solar?
We haven't. We've thought about a number of things. You could require that, or, you could also look at, through the energy efficiency and weatherization programs, you could identify the best candidates for shared solar participation, so depending on the electric load of the house or overall energy burden. So, those are all considerations, but we haven't, if you have some thoughts on what the right approach, would be, or a few approaches, we'd be happy to talk about it. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris, and Alfred, and the rest of the team. And I should mention that Chris was pinch hitting here today, so nice job. We will check your stats later, though.
Yeah. We did check the stats. I was right. So yes, we're thinking $6 million. Yeah, in the first 2 years. Yeah.
So obviously, a lot more discussion is warranted for this particular program design, and I know NYSERDA's door is always open to be hearing your thoughts, and are also doing proactive outreach. So yeah, thank you again. So now we get to move into the fun part of the agenda, which is a bit of more free form here, no formal presentation, but to really start thinking about some of the considerations that were in the order that the commission asked us to consider. So we're really, staff hasn't given a tremendous amount of thought to any of the aspects that were that the commission requested that we look at. We've started some initial thinking, but we've been dealing with a lot from the order and preparing for implementation of that. So we're really looking at this conversation as the first to really hear from everybody on their perspectives and potential positions on what the commission had asked us to look at with respect to a few items here. So as Tom mentioned earlier, this all culminates in a report, a white paper proposal from staff that we'll submit by September 1st of this year. So, certainly this is the first conversation, but as we iterate with our thinking and hear more from you, it certainly won't be the last time that we get to interact on these issues. So the first up is agenda item number 3, the Interzonal Community Distributed Generation Credit Program. So first off, what the heck is a zone? So maybe providing some background there first. So under the CDG rules, as you may well know, a customer participating in a community distributed generation project needs to be located both within the same service territory, but also within the NISO load zone. And so what the commission was envisioning here is whether participation could extend beyond those boundaries, and by considering that if that would be providing opportunity, flexibility to be thinking about greater participation from low-income customers. And I think the classic example here is thinking about New York City, where land is expensive and it's hard to site larger projects. So there's a huge population and demand for electricity and a large low-income population. So, is this something that, we should be giving consideration to? So a lot of work would need to go into considering this program, and I think we've got a lot of homework to do, and hope you can help direct us in terms of some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves. I mean, some of the ones that jump out to me just initially are pricing, administration, billing. I mean, these seem like pretty sticky issues when you're talking about maybe not as much when you're crossing the NISO zone, if you're staying within a utility, but certainly anything that contemplates moving beyond the utility service territory, it's a sticky ball of wax. So I don't really have much more to say other than that, but I'll ask to see if any of my colleagues have any thoughts that they want to offer. Otherwise, we can open it up for discussion, or Tom or Honor. Good enough. So who's up? We'd love to hear from you. Why is this idea amazing? Or why is this the worst idea you've ever heard of? Or anything in between?
So I'll go. This is Amanda for the City of New York. Obviously, like Peter says, this is a very sticky issue, and there's a lot of details to still be worked out and worked through. But the city is very interested in this idea because, as everyone knows, space constraints are a huge barrier to building CDG down in the city. And if we could come up with a workable interzonal concept, I think that would be worthwhile, examining to see if that's even an option. So we're definitely supportive of moving forward with at least looking at the concept to see if it's workable.
So something just occurred to me. Oh, I'm sorry. You're Adam. I'm Adam. Am I? Really? Okay. Yes, I'm Adam. Ron, I'm going to introduce myself. So one problem this could potentially solve is the mobility problem. In other words, we were talking about the challenge just a minute ago of people moving, and that's true around the state. And so if you had a truly statewide program, would that matter as much? I don't know the answer, but it sounds like this might help. On the downside, I'm concerned with what I would call the political optics of this. unless the state aggressively addresses what's become a bit of a viral movement to opt out of the tax exemption and impose moratoria upstate, i.e. if what we're seeing is arrays located upstate with benefits downstate, you will have a problem, I guarantee it. On the other hand, if we can make this work, there's all kinds of benefits that I can see. But I think that's one that should be watched out for.
I have no clue at the end of the day how this could really work well. It doesn't fit with the mindset that I've had of going to scale in buildings in the city. Then it may well be just a way of getting generation and the benefits of solar generation to residential customers. So I can understand that. But I've had a 15-year mindset that energy efficiency as the first renewable plus solar on rooftops would get more people engaged in the community, in neighborhoods in the Bronx where I work, in this process. If it's just a credit on the bill, it's like when the ESCOs began to offer reduction on the bill. Most of the time they lied, as it turned out. Our experience in the city has really been a disaster in terms of how bad the behavior was. I don't want a repeat of that with it's on farms upstate and delivered as supply, the benefits and a credit. I'd like to see going to scale, achieving the 80 by 50 goals in New York City means you've got to have everybody engaged. So my bias is please overcome that hurdle that I see.
This is Dennis Fair from Intersolar. I'd like to really remind us to look at the LMI market as a subset of the whole REV process and the value of DER tariff proceedings, because it's really the regulations that are going to make the markets. And, REV is all about creating a market-driven instrument here. And if you want to get to scale, you have to create a business model that works and that can be repeated. We're getting way ahead of ourselves trying to go interzonal when we haven't even figured out how to do community solar upstate yet. So building community solar projects upstate to serve downstate isn't going to work if we can't figure out how to make community solar projects serve upstate yet. We're on the cusp of this, but we've got a long ways to go here. So I think regulations really need to come first. You're not going to have dedicated LMI CDG projects until there is a business model that incentivizes that. And right now, that doesn't exist. It just adds additional risk to the CDG market that is really steering the market away from that sector. And truth be told, there really isn't even a market yet. I mean, there's not even a megawatt worth of community solar projects online. So we're getting way, way, way ahead of ourselves. But we do need to be thinking ahead. And I think that, NYSERDA's role in all of this is going to be key to taking that structure then and creating something that does steer the market towards that. And through this aggregated buying of credits, you can accomplish something like that. But it really needs to be under the umbrella of VEDR, CDG in general. So don't think of it as a subset. And then, of course, the green banks role beyond that and taking those projects and saying, hey, okay, now how do we make them more viable so that there's a greater pie from which to draw that 25%, from which to tie it to energy efficiency, which should always come first in any discussion of energy. Replacing wasteful energy with renewables is just, fraught with problems from the get-go. But so we do need to think holistically, but this is largely opening up additional regulatory challenges moving between utilities and zones that, we haven't even begun to grapple with the basics just yet.
Thanks, Dennis.
Hannah Masterjohn, excuse me. So I know that my company and many other community solar developers I've talked to are really excited about this. We think it's interesting. We think it could open up a lot of new opportunities. and help better serve the significant demand in New York City. I agree totally, Dennis. There's a lot that would have to be figured out here. I would say, in my mind, this would be a different thing than what CDG has been to date, right? Which is fine. I think we're going to need a lot of different options to serve everyone that we need to serve here. So I wouldn't, I don't think folks should worry too much about the impact that this would have on really community-oriented projects. I mean, that's a different. It's just a different thing, and so, presumably there would be, with the processes that would be required to transfer, credits and dollars and communications across zones and territories, there would be some additional, transactional costs there. So the CDG structure might look a little different. So we're all for it. We think it's exciting. I don't think it would. I don't think it would replace, the sort of concept of a community-based project as we know it.
Hey, Peter,
Yeah.
can I say something?
Yeah.
It's Warren Myers from the Department of Public Service. Those are all really good comments, and one of the good things about trying for the long run to create a market is it gets us some stability that typical government subsidy boom and bust gets us away from that issue. You see it at the federal government level all the time, and it's something we've really worked hard for ever since the RPS or even before that. So that having been said, however, I don't know of any, going back to the person from Buffalo with PUSH, any hurdles or any regulatory barriers to a co-op-like model for developing CDG. I know that there's a learning curve, and we're willing to work with everybody. And the idea is the CDG developer, whether it's for-profit or for a nonprofit organization or co-op or whatever, that the operator, the developer, would be the one that becomes intimate with all the complicated details, not the retail customer. And there would be a lot of us would be willing to work with whoever that is, for-profit, not-for-profit, whatever. On the issue that Peter raised about the current rule about being within an ISO zone, it seemed to us that one of the steps we took in the VDER tariff was to move a step away, except for the grandfathering, a step away from net metering, where the benefits were tied to and the crediting and value was tied to the location of each off-taking customer, and move towards the valuation of the commodity, the ICAP, the energy, even the distribution value, to wherever the solar array is located. And that seemed to us to allow us to relax one of the rules, which is that you have to be within an ISO zone even if you're at the same utility. It seems to us, as long as we're valuing whatever zone that machine is in, that the customers within a utility could be anywhere throughout that utility. So we thought we could at least relax that. Peter's right that when you get to transferring value across utilities, it's a much more difficult question, because what you really have is this, the machine I call it, at a distributed level, injecting power into the distribution system of one utility, and all the accounting that goes along with that with respect to your ISO bill, and all of that has to be traced so that the credits and the cost of the VDR tariff are matched up within a utility. If you go beyond a utility, it just gets messier. But within a utility, I think it would be relatively straightforward under the VDR tariff to relax that one restriction.
Hi, Kelly again. Just to add some sort of color from the ground on this, I get emails almost every week from people who want to sign up for community solar, but are often in zones or utility territories where that's not yet possible. So it's unfortunate to have to tell them, sorry, you have to wait. But at the same time, with our experience at Solstice, talking to thousands and thousands of customers or potential customers and going into communities and door knocking where there are solar projects and saying, hey, we'd like to help you get signed up for this, the rates of interest and conversion to people who actually sign contracts are so much higher in the immediate vicinity of a project. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, and some of them are the fringe benefits that come with actually having a project sited in your community, including the economic value, the job creation, and also if we're talking about creating these sort of smart consumers and environmentally forward-thinking consumers, and we want people to feel tied to their energy consumption and conscious of it. I think it's a lot easier when it's in your community, or at least in your county. We're talking about getting much further out. I think it gets a little more challenging. So I mean, I'm definitely supportive of the idea in that I think it's, in the very short run, helps people get access to these projects who would not otherwise have it. But I think we just have to be cautious that there doesn't an imbalance is not created in terms of continuing to exclude certain communities from being able to host these projects.
Thanks. Yeah.
Just,
David.
Yeah, Dave. I think the complications of between utility districts, also the EAMS, I would think it might affect the calculation process.
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we bring it down a level to Warren's idea about the relaxation of the within a NISO zone? Is there within a utility? Thank you. I mean, is that what do people think of that as an initial step?
Sure. Dennis Fair from Intersolar. So, trying to site large ground mount projects to serve the New York City LMI population anywhere in Con Ed's territory is going to be challenging. So I think ultimately when we're talking about solar at scale, 50 by 30 in New York State, we're going to need to solve this problem at some point. There's really no reason why someone living in New York City couldn't be receiving monetary credits from a project that's located upstate. Transferring volumetric credits across interzonal territories, is going to be a lot more challenging. But again, it's a regulatory structure that allows for a market to function, whether it's LMI or wealthy investors in New York City who want to own projects upstate. But I think contained within this whole discussion is whether or not it's going to be ownership or energy that someone is buying. And I think particularly when you're talking about scale solutions, it's going to be an energy market and not a cooperative ownership market that's going to drive volume. That's going to be a subset of it. You're going to have co-ops, but it's very difficult to organize them. It's how community solar started out in a KW ownership model, but it's moved to an energy model. And I think ultimately that's where the solution lies. But regulations will come before anything else because regulations will make the market.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, would love to hear from the utilities here on any of this.
Brian McNerney from NYSEG and RG&E. Just kind of a follow-up for Dennis. So in the wholesale market, I'm trying to think of how this is different or similar to buyback tariffs that we have right now, or the ability to sell into the ISO right now. So if a co-op from New York City wants to buy a generator upstate and reap the benefits of that, why can't they do that now?
I think that theoretically they can. Basically in a VEDR model, the value of that energy is where and when it's being injected into the grid. So if you're building a CDG project upstate and you're trying to offset 20 plus cent power downstate and you're only generating it at 8.5 cents, that presents a challenge right there. But obviously, the land masses that we have to locate these systems is going to be upstate. We're going to have to solve it. Transferring those credits monetarily across an on-bill platform can't be done today. It could be done through an investment vehicle where investors downstate own an asset that's upstate, but that's kind of outside of where we're at right now. So I don't think there's a market for that yet. I don't think that the investment community understands VETR yet. I don't think many people do. We're getting way ahead of ourselves. We have to be thinking about this, but I think really the discussion right now is more, how do we take markets that currently exist and involve LMI customers in that under phase one, because that's what you want to do. You don't want to wait 3 years to roll out an LMI solution. You need to think about this in stages. And how do we site these projects within the city, tie them together with energy efficiency measures, de-risk them through creative master metered models? That's all doable. There are solutions that we can implement today under phase one that will get projects done. But we need to be thinking 2, 3, 5 years out. What does this whole REV model look like, and where does LMI fit into it, and what needs to change on a regulatory scale to allow all of that to happen? So,
is there anything, mechanisms or services that any utilities have thought about with respect to the DSP that would sort of act in a manner that would, serve the intent of what we're thinking about here? Not necessarily, thinking about crossing service territories, but just in terms of products and services that the DSP would be providing. Is there any synergy there? And don't reach too hard for an answer if you don't have one. That's fine. I'm just thinking outside of the box here. Okay. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions?
Just to follow up on that question. So in this scenario, either if it's crossing zones or if it's trying to figure out how to cross different utilities' territories, who are we thinking would be putting in the work to figure that out? Are we saying that is the utilities' job to figure that out? Is that the PSC's job to figure that out? I think in respect to the idea that, so both. Yeah. I think in respect to the idea that we said earlier that this isn't going to fix all of the problems, how do we weigh how much time we put into this in relation to how much time we put into some of the other topics, and who could do either best? If utilities and solar developers really want to enter an LMI market right now, and this is something that will make that easier, is that something where we do pilot programs to help them have room to develop those ideas so that other entities can work more on some of the regulations to get through some of the other questions that are just as important and maybe more so important in a sense. I would just hate to see, because I think there are a lot of really smart people at utilities and really smart people at the PSC. How do we leverage those in the right directions? And just as a small question, do we have an idea of who would have to do that work? Is that something that I guess that's your last question, but is that something that utilities have people who work on currently?
I can take a shot at that answer. So I think what Dennis said is right. We got to take things one step at a time. And I was really bouncing it off the utilities that the old requirement that you have to be within an ISO load zone, even if you're in the same utility, in my mind, under the value stack is now obsolete. We don't need that speed bump anymore. So that's something I think we can do away with right away, but bouncing off the utilities, they haven't commented on that yet. It's unfair for them to react in real time, but just to think about that. On the across utility service territories, it's a much bigger issue, and it's a lot of inside baseball with respect to when power gets injected into the system and you do nothing else, automatically some customers already benefit. just through the way that rates are set and the way the ISO, I'll call them the ISO meters start to register and how those benefits automatically get distributed immediately throughout. So we got to trace that down. And our principle has always been in this the VDER proceeding is that we want the cost responsibility for the credits that get paid to the CDG project to follow where the benefits went as much as possible. So that's for the power stuff. And yeah, that would have to be worked out because that's all according to each utility's accounting and systems and how everything's happening. As Dennis knows, the other part of the benefit of the VDR tariff for mass market customers, for small commercial and residential customers, is the fact that net metering, that their bills, their rates are set, were never set with the idea of a community or distributed generation bypass in mind. They were set based on a whole lot of social issues so that small customers get a benefit for every kilowatt hour they reduce that is different than the value of the power that's injected into the system. So there's a piece of the net metering benefit we put into something we call the MTC. And I won't go into too much of the details, but transferring that across utility lines, I think some people that benefit. To say, okay, Con Ed customers, as Dennis said, build a machine upstate, but back down your bills downstate, or at least value that machine for its commodity value upstate, but then let's talk about its retail value downstate for that piece of the benefit that's not really what is the value of the injected system. Some thought that that might be a policy way to deal with this issue, that it costs a hell of a lot to do stuff in New York City. And so even though the rates are so high, it doesn't, even under net metering, it's, I don't know, something like 100 megawatts in Con Ed, something, which proportionate to how big the company is and how many customers they have is not very much. And so is there some way we can address, it's cheaper to do stuff upstate, but to encourage customers who want to see their bills go down downstate? Is there some way we can address that policy issue? And then that starts to cost the other customers at Con Ed that don't participate in these things some. So that's what I'm trying to say, that's a longer term policy issue we've got to deal with. Maybe it's better to fund future programs with a statewide surcharge or something, because net metering has really hit certain small utility customers harder than other O&R in Central Hudson. So I think the first step we can do is, yes, address the across zone stuff. A lot of the inside baseball would be us, the utilities, and the stakeholders that really have the patience and the time and money to sit with us and say, no, we disagree, you should do X, Y, Z. And we've been doing some of that in the VDR process. But going across utility lines is something that I think is more of a phase 2 policy discussion. And it's more about, how do we fund what the state wants to get done by 2030? What's the fairest way? Well, that's just one of the issues. What's the fairest way to fund all this development for all of our futures? Is it just one utilities ratepayers? Is it all utilities ratepayers? Is it the whole state's taxpayers? A lot more complicated issues when you cross utility lines.
Yeah, I think I just really want to hit home the local element of that as someone from Buffalo, figuring out, downstate, upstate, what energy goes where, who gets what when, how much investment is going to New York, how much investment is going to the upstate that was divested the most from in certain periods of time. Just like really allocating our time and keeping it. If upstate has these resources now, how do we make sure that those benefit upstate first and then send things in other directions without, stopping that development, but maybe putting that work on other, not the PSC to regulate that portion until that's, or not unregulated, but, ask the utilities to put in the extra hours to figure that out while we figure out things upstate and model things. So, I don't know. That's my piece.
Yep.
Some of the things to figure too is what does if you build in NYSEG territory where land is cheaper, and the benefits are going downstate, you all that behind the ISO level meter generation has an effect on the upstate energy price. So it's changing that. As if you get to bulk, there's you don't think that.
You know where I come from with respect to price suppression. It's temporary, and we're talking about machines that have a 14% capacity factor. I mean, it's not like we're talking about, well, no, I'm not.
Well, the thing is, though, the same energy that's produced upstate ends up either in NYSEG or in Con Ed. It just costs more to get it to Con Ed.
Right. I would separate the commodity benefits. Obviously, the local distribution benefits and value are going to be at the NYSEG level. The rate benefits,
and that's where
the MTC.
Right, and that's where I get back to, you split that out, and then aren't you back to just buyback tariff?
No. Jurisdictionally, no.
So this is a discussion that could get really into the weeds. That is deep regulatory policy, deep stuff. It's not going to solve any of today's problems. It's something that we need to be moving towards right now. It adds a great deal of complication to the subject matter, solves nothing. At best, you would be building NYSEG Zone G projects for customers upstate NYSEG. That doesn't solve the problem here. That just creates, a market signal for something that is going to just take us off target here. So important in the long run, because you're going to build the assets upstate if you're going to hit 50 by 30. But that's not today's agenda, really.
Right. I'm just suggesting in phase one, just within a utility, get rid of the what I call the speed bump with respect to where customers are located zone-wise. I don't think it's necessary anymore now that we're valuing it at the location of the machine.
True. Be careful what you signal there.
So other thoughts? I think we have here first.
Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to say to you. Yeah, the market hasn't become mature yet. It's certainly not self-sustaining yet, but we just got notification from ONR that they hit their 85% trigger, so the train has definitely left the station in certain places.
Why don't we go with Amanda and then Melanie?
So I saw Marty stand up, so then he made me think of the generic the generic low-income proceeding. And a question to staff is, this is all focused on low-income customers. And we don't know what the benefits are going to be yet. We don't know what the costs are going to be yet. Has staff considered the interplay between this low-income CDG idea and how that could affect the generic low-income proceeding and energy burdens for low-income customers? Just putting that out there.
Yeah. Marty, do you want to speak to that? No. I don't. Yeah.
Hi, I'm already wishing I had remained seated. It's a great question, as always, and I think the interplay is the affordability policy that the Commission articulated last year and is now putting into effect in implementation plans that are at all the utilities, is to try and reduce the low-income households' energy burden to an average of 6%. One way to do that is with a direct cash discount. It's a subsidy from participants in the program to non-participants. That's sort of the first step in the affordability policy, is to affect it through discounts. But the Commission was clear in all its orders in the generic proceeding that we can't do this with subsidies alone. There's going to have to be approaches that leverage solar energy efficiency a variety of weapons in the arsenal. There's no silver bullet to solving the affordability problem. It's more like silver buckshot. So we need all of these initiatives to bear fruit to the extent that we can achieve that 6% energy burden through reduced commodity costs, because customers are receiving a metering, not necessarily net metering, but a value of DER credit through receiving solar kilowatt hours that reduces the amount that we have to rely on through subsidies. So they're definitely related.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, first of all, let the record show that unlike my colleague, I am in favor of gun control. I want that on the record. No,
Warren, I'm packing today. So.
Yeah, I bet you are. I never turn my back on you. I think if you look at the order, it really came from a lot of the motivation behind community DG, which was we knew net metering was benefiting certain customers, and there was even a national conversation going on about whether there was income inequity involved and who could take advantage of what some called a subsidy. And as the order pointed out, one of the motivations of the CDG order was to try to include as many customers, including LMI customers, including customers that live in residential situations that don't lend themselves as easily to rooftop solar, to participate in our move towards a more sustainable way to generate electricity, a more distributed way, and hopefully more efficient and environmentally friendly way. So that includes the LMI community. So we care about low-income customers. We have different programs for addressing that concern. And so I don't think they all have to be in a beautiful, orchestrated, single program. I think this came out of the recognition of why we were very interested in CDG, and we didn't want to lose sight of the low-income part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Melanie, is next.
Yeah, Melanie with Vote Solar. I'm glad that the conversation here has turned back toward the customer, because we were getting into a very wonky, very technical, weedy kind of place. And so I do think that we really ought to continue keeping the customer as our focus, the low and moderate income household that we're really trying to serve. I think Vote Solar is excited about the concept of interzonal play, because we think it's one way to help address the energy burdens of the customers that we're trying to reach. But on the flip side of that, we also think that should not preclude continued work and continued investment in community-based projects to make sure that the customers that we're trying to reach do have a significant level of engagement with the new energy economy that serves them.
Thanks, Melanie. I think Ron, did you have a question?
Yeah, quickly. We're sort of opening up a rat's nest here in that we have utilities that bridge states. NYSERDA famously complained that when they subsidies, their SREC contracts ran out, the SRECs ran to Massachusetts. We have a issue in utility capacity zones, capacity zone 3, I think, bisects Orange and Rockland. So we're getting into the deep grass, as Dennis said, and I think we'll be better served by functionally considering the term, which is distributed generation. That means that really you can put production into the load pocket with clean energy and solve problems. And I think the solving problem is really what we should be focusing on.
Great. So why don't we just do maybe one more comment, if there is one. I'm getting the themes here loud and clear. So
yeah, Chris Raup with Con Edison. I think it's important to go back to what we talked about initially, which is I think the challenge for LMI customers is really a financing challenge. It's not really is there open space or cheap land kind of challenge. I will totally agree with Dennis as a company that occasionally has to buy land in Westchester. This is not, bargain basement land you're talking about. People who have horse farms in Bedford are not eager to turn their turf into community DG, and certainly not at a bargain basement price. So I'm not sure that you get that you accomplish a lot there. To the extent that that people are interested in pursuing this idea, I think it's important to be really kind of specific about how this works, and it might be helpful for maybe staff to or somebody else to outline whose meter is taking the power, what are they buying, who's paying for the different elements of the value stack. I mean, certainly some elements of the value stack are very locally specific. The LSRV and the DRV are things that I don't think you can transmit by wire to another utility. And then the other reason I think it's important to be specific about what the transaction is I think we are encroaching on FERC issues here at some point potentially. And in order to do that analysis, you really have to kind of know exactly what the transaction looks like. Are we buying energy here? Are we buying something else? So.
Thanks, Chris. Ma'am? Sure. Yeah, and that's certainly, I think, what was contemplated in the order. Well, why don't we move on? Lucky for you and lucky for me that the commission did ask staff to develop a report on the feasibility of this, and so I'll no longer be here, but but I know that they'll be busy at work in the back room coming up with the contours of this issue. So I think Chris has a great idea with really, I mean, if we need to contemplate this, drill down and think about what the aspects of this are. So,
but I think Ron had a good point too. Is what problems was the proposal trying to address, and take a step back and say, okay, what alternatives do we have to address those same problems rather than just try to force fit something through that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we can move on, and the next agenda item is as equally as elusive as the last one that we discussed. There was what I'd like to describe as sort of a catch-all consideration of other approaches that, the commission staff should be taking a look at or considering to, incentivize and encourage low-income participation in CDG. The order specified, projects that were comprising a majority of low-income off-takers. But, certainly if you have comments or perspectives, I don't think you need to limit it to those situations. I think what we're looking for here is just really ideas and thoughts on near-term solutions. So we heard from NYSERDA and the Green Bank on some of the good work that they're involved with, but what else is out there? What are we missing? I know that the CDG LMI Collaborative uncovered quite a bit of material to think about, and Tom and Honor mentioned some of that at the outset here, but what else is out there? What should we know? We have to continue to consider this over the coming months, so what advice do you have for us? So that's an open invitation. Who would like to go first?
Hannah Master John. I'm going to convey an idea that's on behalf of my colleague Jamil Khan at Tesla, which I think he brought up last Wednesday or Thursday at the technical conference, which is something that I think is a little bit of a new idea. And it derives from the original CDG order and then the modification to it as part of the March 9th order, where you have excess credits, excess bill credits that expire at some point. And initially it was after a year, and now with the March 9th order, it's after 2 years, if I understand correctly. And, I think there might be different predictions in terms of how many credits that will be, but it'll be greater than zero. I mean, it could be a lot, could be a little. And right now, those credits literally just vanish into thin air and they don't benefit anybody. So I think, in addition to a lot of the ideas we're talking about here today, we could think about, could those credits be put to use to benefit low-income customers, and what would that look like?
Can I clarify
Yeah,
just
sure.
because everybody knows the VDR order has its complications. So what Hannah's talking about is not the credits that have been allocated to customers. Those continue, for 25 years. It's the credits that the CDG organization doesn't have enough customers or enough customer load to allocate to. So those have a shelf life of 2 years.
Yep, correct. Yep.
Have any other jurisdictions thought about this, or is there any data point from other states?
I believe, I guess I'm on the record. I was going to say don't quote me on this, but too late. I think that Oregon is considering it in proposed rules, but that's underway, and I'm not sure exactly what the details are. There's a number of ways it could be structured. There could be a if NYSERDA has identified a list of potential customers, you could look at how to simply allocate the credits to those customers. I think what Jamil mentioned last week that he wanted to raise again was the concept of how could you get a win-win here in terms of there being sort of an established guaranteed purchase of those credits at some rate, which would assist potentially with project financing. So, that's a little tricky because, again, you don't know necessarily upfront how many of those credits there will be and when they will be there. But that could be something interesting to look at. So just another thing to throw on the table.
Thanks, Anna. Who else? We've got Brian.
Just a clarification on Warren's clarification. That those 2 year, the developer has 2 years to reallocate those credits, so they don't go away. So and the project is supposed to be 100% allocated to customers. If prior to that month's billing, one of the customers moves out or what, and you find yourself at 98% allocated, you have 2 years to reallocate. You have that money sitting on the project, and you just need to reallocate it within 2 years.
Thanks. I certainly think that's worth looking at. My concern is that we don't know exactly what kind of value we'd be getting there, what kind of volume, so it may make sense to build in something more predictable and consistent. And so I think something that's been discussed and should continue to be discussed is the idea of building in a value into the stack for projects with a certain percentage of LMI participation. And I think we need to talk about what that threshold is as well. I think the wording here is a majority, so 51%, but recognizing without just sort of checking the box that we may need to look at something that's a little bit lower given skittishness of financiers and developers in including that population in droves. But certainly wanting to maximize the ability for folks to participate. So maybe looking at something like 30% instead, just sort of as an arbitrary anchor there. Of course, there's the question of how do you establish this value? How do we figure that out? And not to beat the dead horse, but the very simple way around that is to provide those projects with the net metering value, and without having to go through the process of figuring out what this additional incentive in the stack would be. So I think there are kind of two ways to go there. Additionally, in a parallel track, we could talk about pilot funding for projects that include low and middle income people. I think that the concern that others have expressed, and I will echo, is that the time that it will take to get this into place continues to allow an unfulfilled promise to go on. And so to the extent that we're able to get projects up and running Q3, Q4 of this year, that would include low and middle income folks, I think that would be significant.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate those thoughts. And one objection, though, that I do have, the unfulfilled promise. As we heard from Hannah, this has been an issue nationwide. So I can assure you that the commission remains committed, as does the state, to figuring out this problem. So I don't think it's just something that New York's dealing with.
So Dennis Fair from Intersolar. So on the implementation side, what can we do today and where can we do it? There's a significant portion of the state's LMI population that lives outside of Con Ed territory that are upstate. So we can focus on the areas that we can do today. Ultimately, the barriers to that market are more in terms of the risk that they represent to the developer. So if we're going to create a market-based solution, we need to de-risk that population group. NYSERDA's proposal to step in and become like an aggregator, a buyer of credits that helps to enhance that market is a very useful tool that should be explored, that can work in those markets. On the regulatory side, you're not going to create separate rates for LMI projects. I don't think that's the way you're going to go on this. Having a tariff that says, the value of the project is this if it's LMI, the value of the project is this if the off-taker is commercial or residential, gets away from that whole concept of the value of the energy is where and when it's being injected into the grid, and not who the off-takers are. But upstate now is where this can happen. We need phase one solutions. This is largely politically driven optics here, that we need to get near-term solutions that involve LMI customers. And we also need to remember that the whole reason that we're talking about LMI originally is because of the cost shift, and taking a further net metering approach to solving that is actually going to contribute to the problem rather than solve it or maybe both ends of it. But that's not the way to solve this.
Thanks, Dennis. Valerie?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment on the risk that these customers pose. It's something that a number of us have been talking about. We just assume that they're risky, and they're not necessarily risky. So one of the things that we've been talking about is, if in fact there is a program, for example, that NYSERDA supports, that it would be helpful to collect some data on how these customers perform in terms of their responsibilities to pay for participation in a project going forward, so that we can better understand which populations are risky, because I think a lot of us understand that just having a low credit score doesn't mean you don't pay your bills. So we should keep that in mind.
Yeah, and this is Dennis again, and I totally agree with that. But a study is going to put us out, another 2 years. If you want to take phase one projects upstate New York and make this thing work, you can do that now. You just need to enhance those projects. You de-risk them. You provide better credit. You lower the interest rate on a project by 1%. You're shifting the economics dramatically. So, you make the market work, move it along a little bit. It's very immature right now. We're just trying to steer it till it grows, create the regulatory underpinnings that allow solar to work at scale in general in New York, and then we'll figure out how to make this thing work, But always it's going to be tying it together with energy efficiency, because you could spend $500 on insulating someone's house upstate New York, and that will save more cost and add more comfort to that household's, well-being than shackling them. I'll use that term with a 20-year commitment to a debt that they don't understand on a commodity product, energy. So, my bias is that helping LMI customers to take on debt to own an asset that produces a commodity that they don't understand is not the scale solution. It's a regulatory environment that protects consumers, that incentivizes a market, that is the long-term solution that we're looking for here.
David and then Jessica.
Sorry. I just want to weigh in on the side of ensuring that, in fact, we consider phasing does make sense, and starting where and sort of test and learn, is a good concept. But let's not just start upstate. Let's start from the beginning. We're working at ways that we can deal directly in the city as well as upstate. But learning in the process, I think, is the test and learn concept has been demonstrated. Don't have to do all the research before you do something, but you continue to do research while you're doing something. The same thing, you learn from what you've tried to do, but try it downstate too.
Right. Just a different set of barriers there, but I think the master meter accounts in New York City is the way that we're going to solve the perceived risk problem and be able to lower costs initially. Upstate, we have all that land. It's rooftops, finding places to site projects in the city. That's the problem.
We have a project this moment that's probably is 86 to 90 kW in a set of low-income buildings in Brooklyn that would real-time but it is master metered.
So just before Jessica goes, we did, and I don't know, Ted, if you want to speak to the petition for rehearing on the master meter issue that we received? You don't have to say anything other than we got it. So we have it. We received it. We'll be considering it. Jessica.
So I just want to maybe second Kelly's idea about adding to the value stack or preserving net metering for projects that have a significant share of low-income people. I hear what you're saying about, where we're going long term, but I think we're trying to solve a short-term problem in phase one, and the concern about whether phase one is going to be accessible to low-income customers and whether developers who are focusing on this area are going to have the value added to be able to do that. And I guess I would push back a little bit on the idea that we're just valuing generation and that's kind of where we're headed. I think with VDER, we're trying to capture a more accurate value. And so we're giving enhanced value to projects that are located in areas that have a specific, that create a specific value for customers. And I think providing community distributed generation to low-income people and getting that population to have the access and the benefits from renewable energy is really important, and actually does have a huge value to society in terms of lowering energy burden. That wasn't captured in phase one. We didn't do calculations to figure out what that value is, but it does exist. And so just like the MTC is trying to capture values that don't exist, I think we could have a transitional credit that we add for projects that serve a significant portion of low-income people to really capture that value and get it into phase one, so we don't lose the time.
Yeah, I want to, this is Adam, echo that and maybe get a little philosophical here. I mean, I think from the EDA's perspective, one of the really profound shortcomings of the way the REV is being done has to do with keeping the silo between climate and energy on the one hand and economic development and employment on the other hand. And I think that that's not merely a values question, it's actually a pragmatic policy question. A lot of what we're seeing going on upstate with pushback against solar, I think could be mitigated heavily if it was clear that there was an employment and economic benefit that was local. I think that pilot projects diversified across every region of the state helps us not to solve the scaling problem today, obviously, but it helps us to try and actually solve some of the siting issues in Con Ed, the value issues upstate, and a whole slew of other issues that we can talk about. It helps us, we only reduce soft costs by building stuff, right? And one of the problems that we who do solarize have faced as this New York Sun incentives have gone down is we build less stuff. Therefore, we can innovate less. And we haven't been able to build any stuff in this case. And I think if you want diversification of project size, you're going to need to have a system that's going to work for community and municipal actors. That is not currently present in VEDR. In VEDR, being sophisticated and well-resourced is really important because it's super complicated and the value stack is too light. So I think there's going to have to be new value inserted one way or the other. There's been some proposals on the table to insert it quickly, and I think we need to do that. We've been talking about pilots for a couple of years now. I think we just really have to do this and include these other elements. Because obviously nobody believes that we can do this by going on subsidy forever, but I don't think we're going to learn anything unless we build in diverse circumstances and have that experience.
Who do you envision participating in a pilot? Who does the pilot?
Well, obviously, the aforementioned community and municipal actors, private developers can partner with those folks if they're not wanting to develop, and most people in our world aren't crazy enough to want to develop themselves. So that's where I'd start. I think we would need to talk about this. Again, this is, in the EDA, we didn't get involved in the VEDR proceeding until late in the game, until October, as we mentioned before, partially because of bandwidth issues, and nothing has changed with that. But also, we didn't really foresee what would come out of it. And when we found out, then we dove in. So, we are ready, willing, and able to flesh out and bake alternative proposals. But, as much as we want to have things move tomorrow, we're going to need a little time to think through the answer to that question, because it's an important question.
Can I just want to, I'm an economist, so I need to address the economic development statement. And I won't get into a debate with you. I'll just say there's a difference economically between externalities and the value of jobs and all those macro benefits. Those aren't externalities. They're in there, all right? But the kind of things that Jessica was talking about, the societal benefit of feeding somebody as opposed to them having to choose to pay their electric bill instead of having a third meal of the day. That's an externality. Or the social cost of carbon and the other benefits of clean generation that the CES is now internalizing in New York State. I know I've my whole 28-year career, I've not been able to talk politicians out of the economic development argument, but strictly from an economist's point of view, there's a difference.
I should warn you, you're talking to a former academic sociologist, so we should probably stop now.
So we live in the same buildings, usually on campuses. But
I take your point. I understand the point.
Just maybe to add to that, maybe the DPS and the PSC could think about those externalities, and NYSERDA could think about the economic development adders.
So currently,
sort of
under
in
the order, they're
solicitation.
slated for phase 2, and I understand everybody would like to see them sooner, I think is what I'm hearing.
Right. Yeah, Dennis?
Yeah, I think that there are impacts to ratepayers, and then there are impact to taxpayers. And while they are one and the same, they exist in different buckets in terms of, or sub-buckets of it. So within the tariff, there's certain things that you can't build into it that can't move around. Whereas NYSERDA, being a state entity, has the ability to impact markets and the Green Bank across territories to address things at a state level, like environmental justice, like jobs. But I do think that there are values that are missing from the stack that should be built into the tariff itself, and there's other externalities that need to be dealt with through a different agency, through NYSERDA, through the Green Bank, and that the value to the state as a whole needs to be considered. It's what bucket, where are we drawing that from, is what the challenge is.
Yeah, understood. I agree. The other thing was the 2% revenue impact. So the value of E, the Tier 1 RECs, the way we designed it, we were able to not call that an impact on the cost shift because the utilities have a responsibility for buying those tier one RECs, and so it was just an alternative way to meet that cost responsibility, so it doesn't eat into that 2% cap. But these other things we're talking about would, and that
Chris?
doesn't mean you can't do it.
I just wanted to respond to the idea of adding a piece to the value stack for low-income customers, which is an interesting idea. The administrative piece doesn't make utilities happy. We're already not super happy about the administrative aspects of VDER overall. But what I wanted to say is that, as was mentioned before, we're trying to get away from this subsidy model for providing assistance to low-income customers and get to something that's a little bit more sustainable. And I think I might be okay with another piece of the value stack if it was a temporary thing. But I would also want to make sure, if we're providing that way another subsidy to low-income customers, that they receive that benefit. And I think one of the things that we learned through the ESCO proceeding that Dave talked about earlier is it's possible for bad actors, and I'm not saying community DG companies are bad actors, but it would be possible for somebody to say, I'm going to take that higher value stack and capture that through my subscription rates to the low-income customer, and none of it gets back to the low-income customer. So there needs to be, I think if you're going to go in that direction, you need to have some mechanism to make sure that the customers are benefiting from that and not just the developers.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. There's also something to be said for certain projects never being able to get built without shifting some of the economics in the first place, such that addressing some of this perceived risk, I think until we are in a place in the market where developers understand that low-income customers or customers who don't have super prime credit aren't this risk, that I think is unfortunately seen as the market standard right now. So yes, I agree, but I think also we may have to think about it at the project level in addition to the individual level.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Sorry, Amanda.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Sorry, just wanted to jump in. I'm Shiva Prakash. I'm with the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and we partner with environmental justice organizations, primarily in New York City. And there's a lot of interest in figuring out how to get these projects done in New York City, specifically with a community-focused approach. And really, the groups that we're working with on the ground are having a lot of trouble figuring out what the business model is to have a community-centered and community-owned project get off the ground. So just as others have been saying, I think the idea that we need to put some money in pilot funding into just figuring out what that is, testing some approaches out, learning, is absolutely critical to get this done. And we don't want to be repeating the same patterns of inequity and issues that we've been seeing play out in the current system with this new rollout. So I think while, I understand the arguments that some of these, perceived social benefits are external, I think if we really want to create a new system that thinks of this stuff differently, we're going to have to try some things out first. And we're just not, what we're working on right now, we're not seeing it.
Agreed. My only point was it will cost where the E-value didn't with respect to the cost shift. And so there were a lot of things being balanced in that order. That was my only point. Now, that can always be reconsidered, but one of the things we're balancing was traditional net metering was hitting some utility ratepayers harder than others. And is that fair and right? And is that the best way to get to our goals? That's all.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know that a short-term pilot approach or infusion of support or extra incentives in the stack, it necessarily means that it's an unsustainable approach long-term for these projects.
With what Chris said about the benefits flowing directly to the customers, and again, remembering that I'm not saying that low-income customers are more risky per se, but in general, low-income customers will have more trouble paying their bill. That's why they're receiving a utility benefit. That's why they're receiving HEAP. That's why they work with HRA and social services agencies for different type of assistance programs. And I want to ensure that, if we're moving forward with a low-income CDG model, that we are really thinking about the benefits and the total cost savings. And I know this went back to NYSERDA's original, I think, couple slides that you gave where you're looking for large participation with significant cost savings. And I think that's a big bill. I don't know how easy that's going to be. And I think when it comes down to it, we have to really understand on a total bill basis, are low-income customers going to be paying more, or are they going to be paying less? And if they're going to be paying more, what does that mean? And that goes back to kind of what Dennis was saying. Is there value in that to the customer where they're just, funding this technology or machine, and it doesn't really mean anything to them? So I think those are all really important things that we have to think.
Jessica?
I just want to push back a little bit on the cost shifting concern. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I've seen studies in many different ways. But the purpose of community solar, one of the reasons we're so excited about it is because for the first time it opens up access for renewable energy for people who have not had access before. And a lot of those people are low-income people and people in environmental justice communities. There's a lot of things that the Commission does that shifts costs to customers. They shall remain nameless, but they are humongous. Some of them are very large. So to draw the line here, when there's actually the possibility of real access and benefits for low-income people, it doesn't sit well with me. And I think that we should remember what the purpose is and why we're so excited about community solar, and think about, this is the real opportunity for access for low-income people and for renters.
And I just want to also add that the issue of shift just does not exist at this level of penetration. There is no evidence for that. The NREL study that came out reviewing this nationwide showed that. Cost shift would be a serious problem if we didn't have more ways of people getting access eventually. If you'd have the haves and have-nots who are getting that lower rate over time. So that's one thing. The other thing is just sort of going back to the point about where the value comes in. I wasn't really necessarily even referring to, though I agree, NYSERDA being the one that injects these other values. We have a state government with many agencies, including Empire State Development, et cetera, and on the ground working on the REDC level, it's frustrating to me, frankly, that ESD is doing their thing, you guys are doing your thing. There's ag and markets that are doing their thing when we're talking about agriculture. I just don't see an integrated strategy here, and I see huge payoffs for each silo. Huge payoffs politically for this silo, and obviously economically for the other silos. So I'm not putting the onus here on people in the room. It's really more looking at how the whole policy interacts with the other policies that are out there.
But just on the NREL study, it was a PR document. I mean, let me assure you, shift happens. we're calculate, yes. At the levels of penetration at certain utilities for certain service classes, it's huge.
So,
and that's what the NREL study didn't do.
So I'll take one response on that one, and then we're moving on. Anybody? Going, gone. Melanie?
Yeah, just Melanie with Vote Solar. So I really actually want to build off of what Adam was just talking about in our low-income solar policy guide. And as we think about opening access to solar for low and moderate income communities, we really are encouraging a holistic approach and really integrating a lot of different policies that need to work well together. Adam talked about, Empire Development and ag and other programs. I think New York is uniquely situated just because of the structure and organizational structure of your government here, DPS and NYSERDA and PSC all working together under the same umbrella. I think you're really very, very well situated to be able to integrate your programming. I would encourage you to consider more ways to integrate job training programming into bringing benefits of CDG and other solar programming to low and moderate income customers. I would encourage it seems like there's maybe a need for greater consideration evaluation of other energy efficiency, other energy assistance programs that are out there as well, making sure that there are no cash flow issues that result for customers who may be benefiting from other energy assistance programs, things like that. So just, again, making sure that what you're doing integrates very well with other programming.
Thanks, Melanie. Who else? I think we're getting to the end of our day, unless there's others that have comments. Here we go.
I'll just add,
yeah, Dennis,
this way, that, as a CDG developer, you have to create an incentive for me to want to do something where it's either going to cost me less or I'm going to earn more, more revenue by doing it. You want to shift my business in that direction. As part of that, you want to create a better value proposition for the customer, for the state to achieve goals, reduce demand in areas, have better demand response programs. All of that creates a better holistic program around energy and serving markets and serving customers and creating the kind of smart grid that we want. But you really have to think about what is it that you're going to do that's going to move me to want to do a project that's going to address that particular subset there. And you're going to lower my finance costs, you're going to increase the revenue, and you're going to streamline that process. And we got to look for near-term solutions, long-term solutions. There's phase one stuff that we can do in New York City now. There's stuff that we can do upstate, and it's just picking them off.
Thanks, Dennis. So what would Dennis do? I think that's what we'll go with.
Sage from Push Buffalo. So I think on the back end of things, all of these policy ideas are going to create the environment that these markets would exist in, but then building these projects, a lot of what I see on the ground just comes down to the financing. So not privileging one over the other, but kind of talking a little bit about the financing side. I think from the customer side of things, while weatherization is really impactful way to reduce energy burden in Western New York, fundamentally it's not the same as energy generation, especially with regards to electric bills versus gas bills. I used to work as an energy auditor, so I would price weatherization projects for install. So I think you throw out a number of $500 as an investment in Western New York. That'll get you half a crawl space insulated, which will get you a little bit of a way towards affecting your gas bill, but won't actually impact your electric. And there are a lot of ways that you see, like space heaters offsetting heating problems, and that's where you see high electric. But they're fundamentally kind of different and complicated in that way. So point being, I think financing for solar, there are ways to make that specific to solar and the algorithm specific to solar and then algorithm specific to weatherization, and really understanding what that is, because from the ground, customers, that's what they see. They don't look at this from up here. They see an electric bill and these things, and they see gas bills over here. So I do, however, think that if those things are being related to each other on the topic of do we have a study to show creditworthiness isn't just, your number. I think there's a lot to be said for how energy efficiency algorithms, when adjusted properly, can be used to get great paybacks on these things. So I think, acknowledging the differences between the two, we could still go to the NYSERDA database on whatever paybacks we've had on these to justify not just looking at credit score. So that's the customer side of financing, but then there's also the developer side. And when it comes to actually getting these projects off the ground, those are very different equations. How do you get all of the capital that you need to invest in this into community-driven projects, if that's the goal here? So one way that I just wanted to bring up is sort of that tax equity topic that came up earlier with the Green Bank. I think especially tax equity for new affordable housing or new non-affordable housing that might switch teams a little bit, if it makes it more investment worthy, to do some affordable housing that includes renewable energy on it. Whether that is submetered or otherwise, that is also a topic to be considered there. Is there a way to own the system itself so if a developer comes in, own the system itself as collateral, but not own the energy that's coming back from it, so that whoever's paying off that loan, rather than buying back the energy and then trying to also pay off the loan, can we set it up and can agree paying back something where they're just paying off the loan and getting that and the tenants are sort of paying back the energy component of that. I think in Buffalo, we're working on a project on a school that we're just redeveloped to be affordable housing and offices, where we've been juggling between a PPA, or how do we figure out how to afford it ourselves, and then how do we pass that down. And we ended up, coupling our low or affordable housing tax equity ideas with that to make it work. So I think there's a lot there. And then lastly, sort of tying together the customer and the developer side of that. To a question earlier, I think that was said, like, how do you want to shackle people with a 20-year loan if they don't understand the commodity of this, or for a commodity project? I think one of the answers there is, like, help them understand it. How do you get people to understand these projects so that they understand these financing questions, so that they, as a community, we can build, that knowledge base so people are making smart decisions about these down the line, and we don't have to do quite as much regulation about it. And that, for me, comes back to democratic control mechanisms for localized community solar projects. I think the way that you get people with a limited budget, especially with a limited budget, to care enough about it, to do their research, and ultimately to trust these processes is going to come from making it meaningful for them. And I think, as we've seen, like, across the state, across the country, that grassroots, I'm investing in my community, I'm investing something in the long term, I believe in this, is going to come from that democratic process. So how do we do a pilot project that both couples the business end of this, but with, some new ideas around democratic control of utilities and energy? I think that's something that if you throw that at some township somewhere who has not thought about this ever, they're not going to pick that ball up without some help. But if they have that help, there's so much that people would want to do with that.
Yep.
I just wanted to piggyback real quick on this. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there another person at the moment?
No, you've got it there.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that CoShare is going to be doing, that's the community-owned shared renewables working group, is working with groups like PUSH, working in the Hudson Valley, working on Long Island, working in New York City, to offer resource training for leaders of community organizations, for local governments, so that they understand the basics of how shared solar project development works, bringing in expertise where needed in terms of deep dives into interconnection, into finance, into land acquisition, whatever it is they need. We do a needs assessment first to find out what do they want. And we're building this toolbox, if you will, iteratively. We're starting at the end of June. And we want to be a resource. We're looking to scale, right? We're looking as the EDA is CoShare to try and have a much larger portfolio. We're kind of stalled now with our current portfolio, but if we can shake things loose, as we've discussed here, we're doing the work that I've just described regardless, because we want people to understand the benefit, but also how to get it, how to actually act as good partners to private developers or self-develop.
I think there's some really good points, the last two commenters, and I know that NYSERDA is actively thinking about their role in all this. How can we increase the efforts around education and marketing and understanding the potential here? So there's complementary efforts, coming from the state as well. So, but your work is obviously critically important because you're on the ground throughout the state. So, Chris.
This seems to be the part of the program where we plug things that we're doing. So I wanted to pile on and just note that as part of our Rev Demo project efforts at Con Edison, we have an LMI RFI that has gone out. We've gotten lots of good proposals back. It would not shock me that some of those proposals that get selected include a community solar aspect to it. And then also we have a petition that was submitted to the commission in October of last year to do community solar 100% for low-income customers on Con Edison property. So, and I think maybe the important thing to take away from both of those efforts is that they'll both be providing data, and I think that's one of the things that's really important if you want this to be sustainable, is for the financing folks to see the real experience of projects that serve low-income customers and what those changes in default rates are, and do low-income customers pay their community solar subscriptions at the same rates as other customers? And we're going to have some of that data coming back. I agree with the folks who said, like, we don't want to wait anymore, and that's kind of the philosophy Con Edison went as well when we were doing both our petition for shared solar as well as our Rev Demo projects. So let's get some stuff moving now and providing data back sooner.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Just to
Kelly.
quickly pick up on that point, since we're plugging stuff, but just to, I think that's extremely important that we're running a Sunshot grant from Department of Energy to do a formal study on whether or not folks with subprime or non-super prime credit pay their community solar bills at the same rate, or if there's any statistically significant difference. And that's a 3-year grant, but I think a lot of what we've been finding as I've been looking for these data sets is that a lot of this information doesn't exist. And so by doing pilots, which is part of what we've been granted for, we're able to collect that data. And I just want to emphasize how important it is not only to do these projects now to, get the assistance that people need, but also we need these data points to be able to demonstrate for scalability that this is possible and that people pay their bills, and that the impact on their rates is significant.
Thanks, Kelly. I think we'll
Can I ask Chris just one question about the RFI? So I know the Con Ed property one is just Con Ed, but for the RFI, is there the possibility for joint ventures or partnerships between Con Ed and private sector developers to develop something?
Absolutely, and I'll just say about the Con Ed, the low income shared solar pilot. Even though it's something that we initiated, we would certainly be working with third party developers to build those projects. We are not experts in building solar, so there's a third party aspect there. But on the Rev Demo projects, I mean, I think one of the, as Marco knows, one of the driving, ingredients that we're looking for in Rev Demo projects is, bringing third parties in, bringing in third party capital and putting some of that third party capital at risk, and kind of jump starting innovative third party developed ideas.
Beyond building the machine, but
beyond building a machine,
developing
they're not all
model, the business model.
Correct, right. Are there new revenue models, not just for the developer, but also for Con Edison? I think, it's great if we can get additional revenues through alternative means, then we don't have to come back to the commission so frequently and ask for, not that we do it very frequently, but ask for rate increases. So less frequently than before.
Excuse me, ma'am?
Can I make one quick comment?
Sure. Okay. And then I think NYSERDA had some additional thoughts as well. And then we're going to wrap up. No more plugs.
No. My name is Lucy Velez, and I coming from Buffalo from Push. And it took me longer probably than what I have to say. Basically, I wanted to say is I had no idea up until about maybe a couple of months ago anything with regard to this type of information into my community. I'm first generation Hispanic. That doesn't mean I don't understand and I don't have the capacity to which understanding what you're doing. And I have been coming to the meetings. I've been working with the toolbox with Rachel and everyone here. And I want you to know that I'm committed to bringing this to my community, and I'm speaking for the Latino, but the other non-English speaking communities, and we're working on different projects to be able to communicate without having to use language, so that they can understand, the immediacy of what needs to be done. So I don't want anyone to ever think that we can't understand this, and I don't think anybody was trying to make me feel bad, but I just wanted to let it be known that we have the capacity to understand, so long as the education is put on before us and we have people enough to be willing to commit to teach, we can learn, we can grow, we can understand, and we want to save. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, when it comes to VDR and our bureaucratic speak, it's not you, it's us.
NYSERDA?
Yes, good morning. I'm Michelle Andre from New York Sun. I'm representing the Affordable Solar Program, which is our low to moderate income initiative. One last plug for the morning. There's been a lot of talk this morning about, wanting to get projects going and demonstrations and pilots. So I just wanted to bring up that we do have our Affordable Solar Pre-Development and Technical Assistance Program, which is out on the street right now. I'm not suggesting that it's a catch-all solution or, offering the types of funding levels that will, you really solve all the barriers here. But it is one way for especially community-driven projects to at least have an opportunity to get started, and it's available now. So I think many people are probably aware of it, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. Yeah, that was in the back of my mind, so I'm glad you mentioned it. All right, so we're on to wrap up and next steps, and then we can get out of here. So I think really not too much in this regard. First, thank you for all your input and feedback, and for keeping it generally positive. Appreciate that. So, staff will obviously take this back. We'll be in consultation with NYSERDA and the Green Bank. And, the only thing on our calendar right now is the proposal by September 1st. But I think we need to think through what happens between now and then. I don't have any preconceived notion of that, and I'll be leaving, so it's not up to me anyway. Far enough. Turn it over to Tom.
And I'll just say, with respect to next steps for those who are staying here at DPS, we do have that September 1st deadline looming. But as Peter indicated earlier, this is certainly not the last opportunity to interact with everyone. And I'll just reiterate that, we heard some really interesting proposals, and to the extent we can get, if you want to file written comments in the docket, that would really help us as we develop our thinking. But I would expect that either between now and the September 1st, there would probably be at least one more formal opportunity, whether it's just an informal round of comments or another meeting like this to try to sit down with everyone, inform them of our thinking to date, and then get more feedback where everyone else is before we formally issue the September 1st paper. Because I don't know, can't speak for everyone else, but staff finds this interaction very helpful, and as we tackle these really difficult issues, it's really nice to have everyone help and bring your thoughts to the table.
Great, thanks, Tom. I think that covers it well. So thanks for coming.